Thank you very much for participating in our question. And with that, we'll take it to our next roundtable. In the first roundtable, we heard about the challenges in the event industry that currently, and in the vocational training that are currently a topic. And now in the next roundtable, we would like to focus more on the technical end and on the ramifications and which professionals in the creative industry work and learn, and how this is influenced by the European Union. As you might know, there are already some certification systems for global qualifications in some EU member states in place. Examples would be the Europass event technician and the senior event technicians. However, in the event industry, the event industry has always required niche qualifications for functions and roles that are very sector specific and limited in numbers. So therefore, we have to ask ourselves two questions, and this is the topic that's going to be discussed in the next roundtable. How does formal certification and competences meet industry needs, and does it further worker mobility? Or does the sector need a broader vocational educational approach? So we will hear about that in a few moments. And I'm very happy to introduce our participants of the next roundtable. So please welcome with me Jan Ovenen, lighting and sound designer. He's event director of the Turku Cultural Center Logomo in Finland. Then we have Jens Björnevold, European Center of the Development of Vocational Training. Mr. Björnevold is senior expert and project manager in changing nature and role of vocational education and training in Europe. Then again, we have Randall Greenleaf from the VPLT, the German Entertainment Technology Association. Randall is Director of Commerce and International Affairs. Then we have Sacharita from the IGVW, Community of Interest for the Event Industry from Germany. And last but not least, we have Mrs. Dr. Steffi Roback from the Institute of Vocational Education and Adult Education at the Leibniz University in Hanover in Germany. So we now take a few moments so that every participant can introduce themselves. And we'll start off with Dr. Roback. Dr. Roback, you're leading the Institute of Vocational Education and Adult Education in Germany. You have conducted projects in the creative industry in which you developed so-called learning nuggets, which allow the strategic planning of continuing education. Could you provide some background about your work at the Institute and development of the learning nuggets?
Yeah, thank you very much. We have developed two focal points in our research and development. In research, we deal with the development of the arts, creative and culture sector up to the cultural education on the one hand, and with the integration of digitization in companies and how continuing and adult education can support this on the other. These through special programs offers teaching and learning formats. So we are especially interested in doing research and also developing this, including digital forms. So we conduct research on needs and interests and develop specific approaches. These include blended learning formats, digital learning platforms also, and as part of those, also these learning nuggets you asked me to introduce. So my first message is that continuing and adult education moves much faster than any other part of the educational system. It is like a little sailing boat to meet the changing workplace structures. These must be analyzed and taken as a starting point. So professional decisions must be made as to which formats are suitable for which needs. So these are my recommendations. My second message is we have a trend towards short learning formats. And the learning nuggets you asked me for, these are very suitable for giving insights, to make introductions, explaining basics, giving transfer ideas, place new topics that make companies competitive, and it gives the individual more flexibility in combining biographical issues. But for extensive competence developments, learning nuggets have to be integrated. So we made quite a few experiences with designing these kind of learning nuggets, but not in the creative sector, but in the crafts and manufacturing sector. So what are learning nuggets? We have two forms or sorts, like very short learning nuggets with 1 to 3 minutes, where the objectives are to set need-based informations related to digitizations, like explaining videos, or longer, a bit longer, 3 to 5 minutes, where we conducted quite complex learning nuggets, demonstrating practical areas of application and potential, showing the potential of digitization projects, like interactive 360-degree images of production processes, animated and explaining videos, and also different interacting forms. So in the end, there is the e-portfolio. So my third message is that these kind of didactic conceptualizations are very complex and very time-taking. It has to be provided also with gamification elements to find acceptance. And my fourth message is, if you want to institutionalize these as part of structures, it needs networks, it needs funding, and also finance. Like our center, where we're providing it, it's financed by 2 ministries and the state of Lower Saxony. So many stakeholders are involved.
Thank you, Dr. Robeck. Very interesting. Our next participant is Mr. Ritter. Mr. Ritter, you're the head of the community of interest of the event industry. Your activities include the standardization of industry qualifications. Could you provide some background about the work of your community and some of the competencies you're trying to validate?
Yes, thank you for the introduction. Our hub, built since 2002 in the community of interest of the event industry, with our colleagues from the accident insurance, with our educational organization, try since now more or less 20 years to implement qualification for the niche needs in our sector. We define in our industrial standards safe working practice, safe processes, but also sectoral qualification. For example, the electrician for event technology or the SQQ2, the rigger. Our job for the moment, our topic, it's really to build links, to build bridges between the different interests, between the different vocational and assessment systems in Germany, but also in Europe, and try to implement of a long run this niche qualification like a really standard who is measurable and feelable for the for our field.
Thank you, Mr. Ritter, for the introduction. Our next participant is Mr. Björnevold. You have carried out numerous research projects on national qualification frameworks and the changing roles of qualification and validation of non-formal and informal learning. Could you briefly describe the European Union's recommendations for the member states in regard to lifelong learning and micro-credentials?
Oh, that's quite a big question, I would say. So perhaps I will start by what you asked to the audience here about lifelong learning, because the question is, what is lifelong learning? Well, it's learning in all different types of settings. It's in the formal settings in school, but it's also the learning at work, and it might also be the learning at home or during leisure time activities. The challenge you face, and I think that your industry exemplifies this, is first of all, how do you make visible this learning for the individuals, for future employers, for future education training? And the second one is, how do you value it? How do you attribute a value to this learning? Because traditionally we attribute value to the learning taking place in the classroom, in the formal system, but we don't do that so much in other session. And this is really at the core of what we are discussing at European level. How can we make visible a much broader set of skills, competences acquired in different settings, and how can we attribute value to it? And I think the development of micro-credentials, and the European Commission and also CEDEFOP is working on that for the moment, is as a way to give visibility, but also to attribute a certain value to these shorter forms of learning, which perhaps takes place at work, during free time or whatever, not in the normal kind of classroom formal education and training system. And I think the challenge, and that is the challenge now faced at European level, is how can you guarantee that these certificates for shorter forms of learning, for non-formal, for informal learning, actually get that value which the individuals are requiring? Can individuals, can learners, can employees actually use micro-credentials? Can they use these niche certificates to exchange them into further education, into careers, into further learning? Do they have any value? How do you guarantee that? And for that, there is quite an important discussion going on now at European level, involving, of course, the member states and also different stakeholders involved in this. How can you make sure that the quality of these micro-credentials is good enough, that micro-credentials is something which is accepted, something which can be combined with traditional qualifications, so that in a way you can use micro-credentials, you can use industry certificates, you can use the traditional qualifications in the combination, so that you build a kind of a learning career throughout life. And we haven't reached that stage for the moment, because the current situation is that there is a kind of complexity of different types of industry certificates. You, of course, have the traditional formal qualifications at member state level. You have the emerging micro-credentials. And I think from the European level, the question now is, how can we link together? How can we bridge these things? And to do this bridging, to do this linking, to make them work together, we have to focus on, well, the quality. Can we trust them? We also need to focus on the transparency. Do they demonstrate the learning outcomes, the competences, skills which have been acquired by these people? So I guess that is a kind of an introduction. This is not a simple area. The problem is that we might actually keep individuals, workers, students, we might misinform them just by issuing a badge or micro-credential. If it doesn't have the quality, if it cannot be trusted, well, then it might be a waste of time. We must make sure that when we award certificates, when we award micro-credentials, new badges, whatever, it must be possible to trust them. There must be a sort of a customer protection involved here. And I think that is one of the key challenges at European level. How can we bring together this complexity? How can we build the bridges? How can we make it possible for people to combine, to make visible and to add value to the very diverse learning taking place throughout life? So that's the starting point. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Björnevold. Very interesting. To complete the round, we have Mr. Ovinen. Mr. Ovinen, the theatre has specific niche qualifications, such as the property master. Do you believe that offering micro-credentials might be a good way to teach the competences needed for those qualifications?
That's a good question, and as we just heard, that it's a question of what are the micro-credentials, that are they? Can we actually trust them? It would be great, because as we've seen in Finland, 65% of people working on events field are actually not qualified in any way. They have no professional training at all. So when we started different kinds of programs to sort of train people on their work, or even in institutions, when there is some sort of degree, official degree involved, it sort of expands the sort of interest into that field. So people are actually joining the education more eagerly. If there is something to sort of to be achieved, like a credential, micro-credential would be great for the small niche areas, but can we trust them? That's a very good question. And I would like to correct just one thing. I used to work at Logomo in Turku. I nowadays I am a CEO of Verkotehdas, an event center and art center in Hämeenlinna. Been there for 2 years already.
Sorry, Mr. Ovinen, for this. Thank you for correcting.
By all means.
So with that,
my place all the time. So
typical for the industry. Typical for the industry. I would like to ask a question on Dr. Hubach, because Mr. Bernafald was talking about quality, and you spoke about this as well in these learning nuggets. Do you have a quality system in place from the standpoint of how to make sure that the learning outcomes do have that qualitative standard?
Well, there are two perspectives I have. I mean, the institutions in Germany all do need a quality management system, but this is not really addressing what we are talking about here. But what we experienced when we are designing these learning nuggets, it's a very interdisciplinary task. There are people working together from different fields. So the quality of the content is coming from the experts, and the quality on how we're constructing the learning nuggets is coming from us, working together with the people from the technical field who design it. So that's the way we address quality. But because we are from the university, so we are responsible for standards in a way, but it's nothing that is acknowledged on a state level or anywhere else. But then we are working together with many people from different stakeholders, and they also give advice. So we have an advisory board for all of this, and it's a big advisory board. So they are all giving their inside perspectives. But another perspective I have, it does not exactly meet the people we are talking here, but we have research with the institution from the creative culture and arts sector. And there we can see when they conduct their learning formats, they are very close with the sector. It's also a networking process. They observe very precisely how workplace structures change, and they talk to many people. And then they also have linkages and cooperations with universities and also with units from the different sectors. But there is also not one quality management system, but many people who take care for it and who give their advice. So it's a networking process, but someone must make the decision. And that is the professional, and in the case, it's pedagogical profession who decides for the learning nuggets in the end.
So it sounds like there's a lot of structure behind that also has to be funded. I'd like to move to Mr. Bjornefald. It's good, by the way, to see a face to CEDIFOP. We're very pleased that we have all these wonderful publications we can work with from CEDIFOP on the European level. But do you have a feeling that the European educational threats, at the moment, a lot of things are happening. It's in the EU level as far as education is concerned, although it's not according to the contract, or let's say the treaty of culture and education belongs to the member states. Do you think the member states are going to be willing, especially after this pandemic crisis, to maybe be more open to a sort of a European say guideline or sort of way of looking into the future of vocational educational training?
Well, if the pandemic would change it, what certainly the pandemic is changing is the focus on learning methods and also the location of learning, which I think will be much more perhaps flexible and varied. I think that is I think inevitable. We have made quite some important experiences, both positive, obviously, like us here now, we can discuss in this format. But of course, it's also putting a lot of challenges for vocational education training in terms of apprenticeships, where you actually need to be close to the workplace to actually get this kind of sort of say the quality of the learning process. So I think it's no simple answer, but that will be changed. That's for sure. I think we have been doing a lot of studies now in the last years on the changing role of vocational education and training. I think what we generally see is that vocational education training is changing from being something of initial training to the 16 to 20-year-old to actually becoming lifelong learning systems. And in that sense, your event here fits very nicely into this, because vocational education training is becoming much more complex, much more kind of rich in a way in terms of age groups which are being addressed, in terms of learning methods, but also in terms of certifications and qualifications, which we are speaking about now. And I think that is something which is acknowledged by member states all over the continent, that VET is changing. Some countries are moving faster than others. Finland is doing very interesting reforms now of the VET systems, going into a lifelong learning approach. Others are perhaps slower, but I think these general trends is something we see across different countries. And then you see that the institutions, the particular solutions will stay at national level, but the broader trends, I think, will continue. And I just to finalize on that, because I cannot give a kind of lecture on the changing role of VET in Europe, but one of the interesting things for this discussion is the general change in perspective towards learning outcomes and competences. The fact that qualifications now throughout Europe, and I would say all European countries now, have shifted their focus from, let's say, input focus on time, on the place of learning, to focus on the outcomes of learning. What can a person do? What do a person understand? What do a person know when you have finished a learning sequence? And this is essential for qualifications and certificates, because a micro-credential or a doctorate, you have to be able to see, must be transparent. What can actually this person do? What do this person know? What is this person able to do having gone through this process? And if you use this kind of common language of learning outcomes or competences, as some countries would like to express it, well, then you are quite far towards what I said, to make visible the diverse forms of learning. And that is also a very important basis for actually attributing value to it. Because if you use learning outcomes competences, then you can specify, well, what is actually the role, the value of this particular piece, let's say, from the event industry in relation to perhaps a bigger degree. And I think this is essential. And this is something we have seen very strong developments, let's say, in the last 15 years at European level, that countries are shifting in this direction. So I think that's been a positive trend in the kind of day-to-day business. I think countries like to stay within their institution systems, but the broader trends we can see are kind of converging. Okay.
Thank you very much. Before we go to the question for Dr. Roback that I just saw in the chat, I'd like to ask Jana a question. I had a discussion with some people from the University of Helsinki recently, and what Mr. Broneford was talking about, this sort of focus on skills and not so much on knowledge. It was very knowledge-based for a long time. Do you see that in Finland as well, that we're looking beyond just knowing things, it's being able to do things?
Yes. Actually, the education in the field of events, it's getting deeper and deeper into the skills education more than just the sort of basic theory of things. Theory is everything, but the skills, it's like going back to the old ages where the master educated the next generation. So it's been, in a sense, it's been all the time. That has been the only route to be a skilled professional in event industry in Finland. But nowadays it's been developed into a sort of like new way of actually professionally educating people using the skills education as much as just the theory part of things. and that's the only way to sort of educate the people that are sort of seasoned professionals already in the field, so that you can bring them in and into this school. At the moment, no one's actually, of course, because of these times, all the people are learning from home at the moment. But that's a challenge. As was said, it's a challenge because we can't sort of get our hands dirty at the moment with the educators. So yeah, but that's something that we are going further into, working with skills.
Thank you, Mr. Ovinen.
So beautiful said.
Can I
just a
jump
second,
in?
Stephanie?
Yeah.
One more thing. Wonderful that said about learning is everywhere, and I think that is something that's also very important. But we do have a question for Dr. Roback, right?
Yes, we have two questions already from the audience. The first one is for Dr. Roback. We heard a lot about the learning nuggets already, and the question is, how are the nuggets assessed?
Well, we have a different form of assessment. It's an ongoing interactive assessment. We are discussing it all the time. We are practicing it also with our students. We also invite our students to design learning nuggets. And then after using it, we're asking the participants who participate, who are using it in a digital way. And also we have a questionnaire in the end when we integrate it into blended learning concepts. And they are also it's an iterative process of developing and assessing. So it's not that we once assess and then it keeps like it is. So it's an ongoing process, but it's also validated quantitatively because we have to, and it's an ongoing communicative process.
Thank you, Dr. Roback. Our next question is more a general one. Is ESCO a good base to describe micro-credentials? Who wants to go first?
I don't think ESCO is the right base to describe micro-credentials. ESCO, like we said or I think as Chris also explained in his first presentation, originally came for the labor market, the European labor market. We're basically just trying to describe competences that go to certain occupations. But I see Mr. Bronnefold would like to say something. I'm sure he's very well qualified to answer that.
Yeah, no, just about ESCO, because I've been involved in ESCO from the very beginning. I think you need to also acknowledge the limitations of ESCO. ESCO is an effort to kind of develop a terminology, a terminological resource which can be used by different stakeholders in the labor market, but also education and training. And that's about it. ESCO is not a standard. It's not in a way kind of normative saying that this is the way occupation or a qualification should be described, but it provides a resource of systematic resource of terms, both in a way related to technical skills, let's say in occupations, because it addresses sectors and branches, but also transversal or let's say soft skills, which we, by the way, are working on for the moment. And so perhaps I would describe ESCO more as a kind of terminological map, which helps you to select terms which might then be helpful in the particular context you're working in. So I think that is the way I understand ESCO, as a resource, as a help, as a map. And I think for that it is useful because it is in all these European languages and it is also developed in the European context. It is, by the way, now a process going on to also coordinate with the American system, the ONET system, to try to see how the links and the kind of added value by looking at convergences actually might be developed. So I think that is what I would say.
I might add that it was the reason why in TB-FLAT, if you saw the presentation from Chris, we take the ESCO competences, but there's a sectoral layer that we describe. In other words, further going, what is an ESCO that gives us sort of a terminology, as Mr. Bronnefold was saying, and how can we add a sectoral layer that's much more specific for the skills and knowledge that is needed in our sector. So it is though we have to remember these things. We're talking a little bit about Europe today as well, and the importance that European organizations are setting these things up. And like I said, I hope that today's conference also sort of brings this idea of looking to see what Europe has already brought to the table. And like I said, CEDEFOP has for the last few years been providing very good publications, very good studies about vocational educational training, and we've been using them very often. Sacha, I would like to have a question for you as well, because I think we have 17 members now in the EGVW. If I
18.
Or 18 now, right? There's
18
already
now,
18
yes.
associations, a very diverse industry, but at the same time, some very common goals as far as educational standards concerned. We're working now on something that's called a sort of a basic EQF level 3, right? For a
EQF level 2.
Or 2, I'm
level
sorry.
3, 4, and 5.
And 5, right. So we're looking for things underneath the level 6 that we would call the senior technician in our industry. How long does it take to have a standard like that made?
More or less 12 months.
Okay. So we're talking about a year for an industry standard.
Yes.
But as we see in today's discussion, we had it in the first panel as well, the industry simply needs some sort of certifications in order to professionalize the industry as well. We have a lot of non-formal and informal learning. It's something Jana was also talking about. That's the basic reason why we started TEBIFAT, is to try to find a way to identify, validate, and certify non and informal learning, because our industry is so much involved in that. Looking to see if there's any questions from the audience, but I don't see any. Then I would like to ask Mr. Bornefold again a question in regard to the member states. Do you have a feeling that the member states are so open to some of the EU's suggestions or recommendations now, because there's also an understanding after Brexit that we may need to move closer together? It's a very political question, but we have the feeling that since the UK has left, that there is a little bit more of this European feeling now developing and saying, listen, we have one of the largest economic regions in the world. Maybe it's a good idea to start talking about how to move closer also in the educational system.
Yeah, I certainly hope so. From our perspective, it's there's a lot of initiatives on the table for the moment, which are important, which I think also would be important for your sector in a way, in terms of actually emphasizing the role of informal, non-formal learning to try to improve the ways we recognize prior learning or learning from different settings, to try to develop kind of lifelong learning systems. So what I see is this interest in, and also the commitment to actually shifting towards lifelong learning system. Yes, I can see that in a way. Then, of course, you have a discussion in the different education council and employment councils on what are the actual tools, instruments, and the money involved. But I think that the overall understanding that you have to move in this direction, that lifelong learning and kind of upskilling for all age group at all levels, and not only university levels. But I mean, it was interesting you mentioned EQF level 3 to 5. I mean, this is a critical area in a way, and also to capture the non-formal learning of people. This, I think there is a general kind of acknowledgement that this is necessary. So then I think we will see this year, I mean, these 2 years have been very kind of exceptional because of COVID, but I think we now have 3 or 4 very important initiatives on the table. We have the skills agenda, we have the European education area, we have a recommendation on vocational education and training. All 3 of them are very important initiatives which contains elements like micro-credentials, individual learning accounts, I could mention in a way, so that people would get a kind of sum of money which they could invest themselves into lifelong learning. These are quite radical suggestions. So at least at this level now, in terms of ideas and in terms of trying to operational lifelong learning, a lot of things is happening. And I think in the next, let's say, couple of years, we will see if this is now followed by commitment by the member state. It's a complex process because there are no things like a directive in the area of education or employment. You have to have an agreement on the objective of the direction. If you get that agreement, then a lot of things can happen. The EQF is a good example of that. There was an agreement. We need a different way of approaching and comparing qualifications in Europe. We need to do that on the basis of learning outcomes. That was accepted, and member states have now done that on a voluntary basis. We now have 41 national qualification frameworks modeled according to the EQF based on a voluntary cooperation. I think that is a great achievement, which goes straight into what we're discussing here. Shift towards learning outcomes, shift towards lifelong learning, and in a way try to see how certification can support learning this kind of diverse learning. So it is difficult.
I have a question again, right?
Yes, thanks, Randall. We have another question from the audience. I believe it's from Mr. Ovinen. Could you explain a little bit further in which way the Finnish experience with recognition of prior learning is more developed than the other EU countries?
No. It's something that we've been sort of trying to sort of work with the field, with the event industry field, with the people working on there, so that we are actually trying to achieve ways of providing the education that they actually urge for. So it's probably just needs-based education, but it's not official, of course. But it's we are trying to figure out how to sort of we are working on this. We just started, I think last week was the first meeting of the steering group of the ETTE project, so that we are actually we've already piloted the safe on stage education, and that's part of the idea that we are actually, even though we are sort of interviewing people, what would you like to learn, in a sense, but we are also trying to sort of involve it into the official or the actual programs that are working that everyone's working on, and ETTE, I think that's a very good example of the idea of the Europe-wide education that is actually needed, even though the people usually think that they already know everything that ETTE gives them. And during the sort of training, they think that when they get this certificate of knowing what ETTE teaches them, they are sort of happy that now we know it, and actually they really can get something more than just the basic things that they used to think they know. But I don't know if it's more sophisticated or are we further than anyone else, but we're just working it in our own way. So let's hope it is.
I might comment on that, because in the next roundtable, I'm sure that ETTE, I'm not sure if everybody knows what that is, will be a topic, and that is a European certification from our industry, basic health and safety, knowledge and skills, and we'll be talking about that with Bastian Schof, and he's also on the ETTE Council. So nice that you brought that in, Janne, that we already have that. I don't know if Mr. Bjornefold, your hand is still up, if you'd like to make a comment.
No, I could comment on this Finnish thing in a way, because we are working a lot on validation of prior learning and recognition. And Finland is indeed a very interesting country, because what happened in the reform of the vocational education training system now recently is that anybody, let's say if you are 16, if you are 35, or if you're 50, whatever your background, can enter into the Finnish vocational education training system. When you do that, then you use recognition of prior learning validation in order to see, well, what's the experiences, what is the knowledge, what is the basis this person brings with him or her when he enters the system. And of course, that is a way of integrating validation, recognition of learning outcomes into the national system, so that in a way you don't go in as a cohort, you go in as an individual with particular experiences, and you use these methods to make visible these experiences, so that you then get an individual training plan which is tailored according to your strengths, but also your weaknesses and your needs. And I think this is a way to see recognition of prior learning, validation of non-formal, informal learning. You need to integrate it into the overall lifelong learning system to help people to really make visible and value learning. And very few countries have actually succeeded in this integration, but there are some developments. Finland is certainly one of the interesting. Okay.
Thank you very much for that insight. As we've seen, there are examples already in Europe that are available. We can all learn from each other. So thank you very much for that. Stephanie, do we have any other questions from the audience?
No, thank you very much, Randall. I think we are perfect in time for our break right now. I would say a big thank you to all of you for this active discussion, for sharing all your insights and experiences, and for answering all the questions. So let's stay in touch. Have a good rest of the day to the participants.
Thank you.
And to our audience, we have a 15-minute coffee break right now. So please be back at 3. And we are looking forward to our last roundtable, From Theory to Practice, Steps Towards a European Certification System. Stay tuned.